Hello, and welcome to Loredive, where we look into the lore of all of our favorite video games. Today, we're going right back into Dead by Daylight, and we'll be jumping into the final group of killers that have been released so far. The Clown, the Spirit, the Legion, and the Plague. Kenneth Jeffrey Hawk Chase, the Clown. Kenneth Chase was born in 1932 during a difficult labor, which his mother wouldn't survive. This event of his birth and his mother's death drove a rift between him and his father that never closed. As the boy grew, so did his father's resentment and his drinking habit. By the time Kenneth was in school, they mostly lived separate lives. Academically, he was unremarkable, coasting by on his significant athletic prowess. He grew tall and strong, excelling at track events, but shunned any attempts to coax him into team sports. On his walk home from school, he would often find feathers on the ground, and soon he began a collection, keeping them in a cigar box under his bed, with his father either at work or in an alcohol-induced stupor. Kenneth had hours to spend alone, transfixed by the regularity of the feathers' barbs, and feeling the softness as he ran them over his lips. Watching the birds that came to the feeder in his garden, he imagined how soft they must be, and resolved to catch one. He ingratiated himself with a local dentist, soon procuring some anesthetic. Using this, he rigged up a trap on the feeder that he hoped would knock out the bird long enough so that he could touch it. After a few failed attempts, he managed to trap a robin. As it lay in his hand, he felt the sudden rush of a life at his mercy. He had originally planned to release it once it had recovered from the anesthetic. Instead, though, as its eyes flickered back into consciousness and began to struggle, his grip remained firm. His fingers slowly tightened around its throat, squeezing until its chest feathers were finally still. He disposed of the body, keeping just a feather, with which he started a new collection, discarding the others as fake. By the late 1940s, Kenneth had left school and started working as a busboy at a local diner. He had also escalated to larger prey, like squirrels, raccoons, and dogs, becoming skilled at customizing the anesthetic and dosage for each. In early 1954, a young man went missing, and the town was turned upside down in the search. A few months later, Kenneth's father, while doing some work in the crawl space under the house, found a cigar box. He broke it open and saw, to his horror, that it contained feathers, animal paws, and a man's finger. Returning from work, Kenneth saw his father leaving the crawl space with a cigar box in his hands. He turned on his heel and never went home again. After a few weeks of living it rough, he encountered a traveling circus, and with his prestigious strength, was hired to work the ropes. With his new start, he assumed a new name. Suddenly surrounded by a close-knit community, Jeffrey had to learn to socialize. He donned his personality like a disguise, quickly becoming known as charming and helpful, and was welcomed into his new family. Over the next decade, he stayed with the circus, traveling the length and breadth of the United States. But with the itinerant life providing few repercussions, he fell into bad habits. Drinks, junk food, drugs. He indulged in all of them to excess. For a time, these vices were enough, but then his old urges returned, and his nomadic existence became a cover-up for him to resume killing. He stole clothes and makeup from performers, fashioning a disguise that would let him get close to his victims before he anesthetized them, or they would awake and find themselves bound at his mercy. There, he would finally have his fun, mentally and physically torturing them, their screams fueling him before being lost in the night. Once their strength was at its lowest, he would carefully examine their fingers, searching for the prettiest, running them over his tongue to find the tastiest. Once he found the best, he would cut it from their hand and proudly add it to his collection, disposing the rest of the body as pointless waste. Men, women, young, old, he didn't care. The essence of a good collection is in the variety, in the memories and stories that they evoke. He removed his costume less and less, shedding his old personality with it, fully embracing the clown, his true self. With time, however, he became complacent and sloppy. A victim managed to work free of her bindings while he was sleeping off the drink. She escaped, screaming for help, and he awoke to find the rest of the circus bearing down on him. He whipped his horse, and the caravan disappeared into the night. Since then, he has roamed the country, a parasite who could always be found at a carnival or circus, but who would never be seen on any playbill. He lured those brave or foolish enough to come near, trapped them, and moved on before they could be found missing. Somewhere along the way, he left the ordinary roads of the United States behind him, traveling through a veil of mist and entering a new realm. It was a place of transience and impermanence, perfectly suiting the life he had chosen to lead. Feeling more at home than he had ever in his entire life, he set up camp and waited for his first visitor. The clown has let years of excess go to his head and his waist, though, thanks to the entity's meddling, he can keep up with most of the killers in the procedural. When it's his turn to hunt survivors down, he uses his unique concoction, the Afterpiece Tonic. After throwing the Afterpiece Tonic, a gas cloud will appear and intoxicate any survivors in the area, slowing them down and causing them to cough a bit until they are able to escape its effects. The clown's first perk is Bamboozle. One should never underestimate a clown's ability to trick others. With Bamboozle, the clown can vault faster than normal. Along with this, whenever the clown makes a vault, the entity will block the vaulted location for a short duration. Only one location can be bamboozled at a time, and if the clown vaults the same location while Bamboozle is active, it will become deactivated. The clown's second perk is Coulrophobia. If the survivors weren't afraid of clowns before, they will be now. With Coulrophobia, survivors within the terror radius of the clown will have a penalty to any healing done within the clown's terror radius. The clown's final perk is Pop Goes the Weasel. With Pop Goes the Weasel, the clown gains the ability to keep the procedurals going for at least a little bit longer. Every time he hooks a survivor, the perk will become active for a short time. During this time period, the first generator that the clown hits will have 25% of its total progression regressed. Afterwards, the generator will regress like normal. The clown waddles around the procedural, tasting the appendages of his victims. While on the surface he may not seem all that deadly, be certain that there is more to him than meets the eye. And if you're already afraid of clowns, he'll give you even more reason to stay away. Rin Yamaoka, the Spirit. Rin was the only child of the Yamaoka family. She was raised in the dusty halls of the traditional house in Kagawa. She studied education at Takamatsu, a private university, which weighed heavily on her family's shaky finances. Her mother fell ill that year, and the bills started piling up. Rin worked part-time in a futile attempt to help lighten the load. Her father faced a debt that grew without end. He started working double shifts in hopes of obtaining a promotion, and that's when he started losing sleep. A dark whisper would keep him awake at night, reminding him of his hopeless situation. Exhausted, he started to lose his grip on reality. Fighting to deny that voice that whispered at night, Rin's father made a desperate move. He met with his superior and explained his situation. He begged for a bonus, an advance, time off, anything. His request was denied. The company had launched a defective production line that was costing them dearly. Someone had to be held accountable, and Rin's father fit the bill perfectly. He was fired after 22 years of service. That evening, Rin came home from work. She'd stayed late to entertain customers that lingered at the restaurant. She parked her bike in the shed when she heard her mother's scream come from the house. She rushed in, climbing up the stairs to her parents' room. There, she found bits and pieces of her mother on the floor. Her limbs were clean cut, tangled up in an unnatural position. Her breasts were sliced up, revealing her rib cage, which was cracked open. Rin gagged, noticing last minute as a sharp katana came crashing down. Rin blocked the blade, which bit into her bare forearm. The shock of recognition interrupted her pain. Her father was yielding the katana with a stoic expression. She cried out to make him stop, but he slashed her arm again. She rushed off and slid on the blood-smeared floor. Using the door frame as support, she raised herself up. The katana ripped through the wall, cleaving her other arm. She screamed in pain as she limped into the hallway, only to be met by her father's blade again. She stepped back, trembling as she held together the soft, loose flesh of her abdomen. Images of her mother's tangled limbs flashed before her eyes. In a fit of anger, Rin charged at her father, making him stumble back. He punched her in her torn abdomen and she recoiled in pain. As she struggled to get back up, he slashed her thigh with the katana's blade, shattering it in the process, making her collapse on the floor. As she crawled towards the stairs, he grabbed her hair and yanked her against a partition. The glass shattered on impact, and she fell through, landing one floor down. She heard footsteps somewhere above her. With effort, she moved, worming her way into a sea of broken glass. The shards gnawed at her, ripping her flesh. He had to be stopped. He would not get away with this, with what he'd done to her, with what he'd done to her mother. Coughing up blood, her chin grazed the glass, adding to the bleeding. A low-pitched heartbeat started to ring in her ears. Her body felt so heavy, she could no longer move. The ground shook with her father's footsteps. She knew she wasn't going to make it, but she no longer cared. She would make him pay, in this life or the next. A dark fog slowly veiled her eyes, but it could not subdue her rage. She would not rest, not yet. The darkness whispered, promising blood and revenge. An oath was made, and Rin closed her eyes. Rin has yet to fulfill her dark ambition to see her father pay for his crimes. So, in the meantime, the survivors of the procedural will have to do. The spirit's ability is Yamaoka's Haunting. With it, the spirit can enter the ethereal plane and will reappear in a new location. Existing somewhere between the dream world and the spirit world, the ethereal plane causes Rin to lose sight of all survivors, but she can still see scratch marks left in the environment and can hear their footsteps and gasps of breath. While moving through the plane, she also moves faster than normal, allowing her to get across long distances quickly. Unlike the Wraith or the Nurse, the spirit is most definitely a ghost, and tapping into the powers of the other side will not leave her vulnerable to Lightbird. The spirit's first perk is Spirit Fury. The spirit becomes stronger the angrier and more frustrated she is. After breaking a certain amount of pallets depending on the perk's rank, the perk will become active. Once active, next time a survivor stuns the spirit with a pallet, the entity will instantly break it. The spirit, though, will still suffer from the stun effect penalty. The spirit's second perk is Hex, Haunted Ground. The spirit has no problem with a little bit of trickery. With Hex Haunting Ground, 2 of the totems on the maps will be traps. If a survivor cleanses one of these 2 totems, all survivors will become exposed for a short duration. If one totem is broken, then the other will become inactive. The spirit's third perk is Rancor. You do not want to catch the spirit's eye. It will most likely be the last thing you do. With Rancor, each time a generator is completed, the obsession will see the spirit's aura for a short duration. On the flip side, the spirit will be able to see all survivors' locations briefly. And after all generators are completed, the obsession suffers from the exposed status, and the spirit gains the ability to kill the obsession outright. The spirit is now trapped in a horrible cycle with conflicting emotions about her current predicament. On one hand, she feels for the survivors, as they are in the exact same position she was in, innocent victims who are not responsible for the rage being thrust upon them. On the other hand, someone has to pay, and if the survivors are the ones who must fit the bill, then so be it. If we can separate Rin from the spirit, maybe there's a chance for her to finally make peace, and escape the endless slaughter on the path that now lies before her. Frank, Julie, Joey, and Susie, the Legion. Frank Morrison was 19 and had little to show for it. He stopped attending school after being kicked out of the basketball team for shoving a referee into the stands. Yet Frank was a man of potential who could light up a room despite his bleak childhood. At 6 years old, he'd been taken away from Calgary to start a circuit of foster homes. No matter how many times he'd lashed out, threw tantrums, and got into fights, they'd kept moving him to a new, unfamiliar house. His last move had been 3 years prior, and his last foster dad, Clive Andrews, had picked him up from the adoption center. They'd been on the road for 7 hours before reaching a small bungalow in Ormond. It would be the longest time they'd spend together, as Clive was usually too busy trading checks from family services for drinks at the bar. Ormond was a small, stale place, a remote town of 6,000 inhabitants where gray winters dragged on for most of the year. Frank did everything he could to get into another adoptive family, but he changed his mind when he caught the attention of Julie, a beautiful girl who was convinced that she deserved better than a life in Ormond. And Frank, as an outsider, was her ticket out. Frank attended the parties she threw where everyone was younger than him and easily impressed, which he liked. He met the impulsive Joey, a young man who liked to show off, and the shy, studious, and naive Susie, who was Julie's best friend. In time, they would hang out at a lodge up on Mount Ormond, which had been abandoned. Their time together was a perfect break from the boring conformity of their small, insignificant, everyday lives. Frank saw it as an opportunity to shape their lack of experience into something powerful. He lined up nights of debauchery and rampage, testing their limits. Bullying, vandalism, and theft were essentially their weekend plans. It came to a point where they would do anything he asked. Nothing was off limits when they put their masks on. One evening, Frank dared Joey to vandalize the store that had recently fired him. They snuck inside easily enough, as the building was supposed to be empty after closing hours. But a cleaner who was still there grabbed Julie as soon as she came near. Hearing her stifled cries, a dark impulse came over Frank. He rushed to her aid, knife in hand, and without hesitating, planted the blade into the cleaner's back. As the rest of the group stared at Frank in shock, he ordered them to finish the job. Joey clenched his jaw with a slight hesitation, before grabbing the knife and stabbing the bleeding man in the ribs. Susie was another story, however. Frank shouted at her. They had to finish what they'd started. Julie closed her eyes and slid the knife into the man's chest before forcefully handing the wet blade to Susie. They were all in this together now. Susie stared at Julie in disbelief as Frank grabbed her trembling hands and inserted the knife deep into the man's throat. Her cries echoed throughout the store. Frank told them to move fast. They mopped up the blood on the floor, stashing the body in the trunk of Joey's car, before driving up Mount Ormond. All four were digging in the muddy snow to dispose of the body when Frank spotted something moving through the woods. He grabbed his knife and broke from the group to check it out. The fog thickened around Frank, becoming so dense he could no longer see ahead. While retracing his steps, he stumbled into an ominous trail. He followed the eerie path as if called by the darkness. Julie, Susie, and Joey finished digging, but Frank was nowhere to be seen. Julie spotted his muddy footprints in the snow, and the three of them followed the trail, which took them deeper into the woods. When Julie, Susie, and Joey did not return home that night, their parents thought they had run away with Frank. Each family came up with a different theory. The mood in the town changed, however, when a body was found by an abandoned lodge up on Mount Ormond. Each member of the Legion are now under the entity's service, though with only one appearing in a procedural at any time. While they all have their own unique personality, they all serve the same function and have the same power. The Legion's unique ability is Feral Frenzy. The members of the Legion have a power gauge that builds up over time. Once full, the members of the Legion go into a frenzy that allows them to sprint faster than their base movement. While sprinting, the Legion can vault pallets and windows quickly, but cannot see survivors' scratch marks or blood pools. If a survivor is hit with an attack while in frenzy, the deep wound status effect will be applied to them, revealing the locations of all survivors that do not have the deep wound status effect at that time, as well as replenishing the Feral Frenzy power gauge. The Legion will lose Feral Frenzy if they cancel out of the ability early, if the gauge runs out, if they miss a survivor when attacking, or if they are hit with a pallet. The Legion's first perk is Discordance. Divide and Conquer is the name of the game for the Legion. Anytime 2 or more survivors are working on the same generator, the generator's aura will be highlighted in yellow, and an audible notification will be given. This notification will continue to be provided every 8 to 12 seconds. The Legion's second perk is Mad Grit. When a goal is just ahead, no one will be able to get in the Legion's way. While carrying a survivor, the Legion will suffer no cooldown from missed attacks, and successfully hitting another survivor will pause the carried survivor's wiggle timer for up to 4 seconds. The Legion's final perk is Iron Maiden. The Legion does not stand for cowardice. With Iron Maiden, the Legion opens lockers up to 50% faster than normal. Survivors who enter and exit lockers suffer from the exposed status for 15 seconds, and their locations are revealed to the Legion for 3 seconds. The Legion now hunts in the entity's game. With varying degrees of willingness, this group of angsty teens are not to be underestimated, and whether or not you pity them will probably vary from person to person. I think it's safe to say that some are more pitiable than others. Adiris, the Plague. When she was 5 years old, Adiris, the youngest of a family of 7, was left on the brick-red, burning steps of the Temple of Purgation at the center of Babylon. To process her shock and sorrow, she held on to the belief that the gods had a plan for her. Her new life was one of quiet servitude. She would tend to gardens, prepare ceremonial meals, and polish incense burners. At night, she would pray for a sign that would reveal her purpose. When she came of age, she attended the high-ranking priests during the yearly worshipping of the sea goat, the god of water and creation. Swinging a censer down in the great hypostyle hall, she cast thick, black fumes that reached the cold, towering stone pillars before dissipating. Her worries lifted, and the resulting bliss made her feel closer to the gods than ever. She worked herself to the bone each day that followed, fulfilling her duties while taking on new ones, as she aided the priests during purification rituals. The priests were more and more in need of assistance. Cleansings were being performed daily to answer the demand from outside the high temple walls, where a catastrophic plague had resurfaced. Within months, the priests had all contracted the disease. It did not take long before they became too weak to perform any kind of ritual. Adiris, having assisted many purification rituals, was the only one who could carry on. The swelling panic had to be contained, even if by a novice. Anxious before her first ceremony, Adiris visited the priest's sanctuary chamber, where she lit the candles and noticed a small, narrow opening at the back. Sliding through the gap, she reached a crypt hidden under the sanctuary. The chamber was bare, except for a golden statue of a woman who stood with outstretched hands, her fingers covered in jewels. It was the sign Adiris had been waiting for. The great hall was packed with followers who bowed down as Adiris entered. She strode to the brick altar and grabbed a ceremonial dagger forged in silver, her ruby fingers wrapping around the blade like claws. The sudden display of luxury intrigued the followers, who were already struck by her youth and beauty. As she began reciting the epic of creation, a woman in the back swooned and collapsed. Adiris rushed to her and noticed the black blisters covering her feet. Without hesitation, Adiris grabbed her sacred blade and swung it at her own foot, severing a toe. She then offered the bloody part to the gods, asking them to protect the woman. A silence fell over the followers, who revered Adiris as their new priestess. Tales of her wealth, beauty, and devotion began to spread across the city as quickly as the disease. Soon, Adiris' followers called her the High Priestess of Babylon. But her faith was tried when she showed the first signs of infection. Her cough became a mix of phlegm and blood. Her neck erupted in abscesses, and her four-toed foot darkened. Ashamed of her condition, she began wearing a veiled headpiece and carried a censer that masked the rancid smell of sick that clung to her skin. Hoping to be saved, she kept performing the rituals, offering blessed water and food to her followers. But no ritual could save her. In a desperate attempt to appease the gods, Adiris banished herself from the city. She traveled north with a few followers, venturing through the cold woodlands of Arashtu, until it was no longer possible to walk. They camped in a dark cave, where Adiris lay in a pool of vomit. Her toe, which had turned black, was so swollen that she could not go any further. Her followers and she realized the truth in that cave. They were all infected with the plague. None of them were going to survive. Kneeling among her retching followers, Adiris made one last prayer. The black fumes of incense rose into the damp air before being wiped off by a cold breeze. Neither the body of Adiris nor those of her followers were ever found, though, oddly enough, many told tales of her eventual return, almost magically cured of the sickness that had ravaged her. But there is no historical evidence of what fate had truly fallen the High Priestess of Babylon. The plague's unique ability is called Vile Purge. With Vile Purge, the plague can release a torrent of infectious bile. A survivor hit by the stream becomes infected. A survivor can become more infected by hitting more of the stream, running, or performing interactions. Environmental options can also be infected for a short duration when they are hit by the stream. If a survivor's infection indicator is completely filled, they are forced to vomit and continue to do so at random intervals. They also become injured with the broken status effect. In this stage, they can pass their infection to other survivors as well as environmental objects that they interact with. Infected survivors can remove all infection on them by interacting with a pool of devotion. There is, however, a catch to this. Whenever a survivor cleanses at a pool of devotion, the pool becomes corrupt. If the plague drinks from a corrupt pool of devotion, the plague gains Corrupt Purge. With Corrupt Purge, instead of her bile causing infection, it damages survivors outright. Survivors that are damaged, but not infected, cannot cleanse at pools of devotion. If all pools of devotion become infected, then the plague automatically gains Corrupt Purge no matter where she is, and all pools become cleansed. The plague's first perk is Corrupt Intervention. The prayers of the plague can evoke the powers of the entity. At the start of a trial, the 3 generators farthest from the plague will be blocked by the entity, preventing them from being worked on for up to 2 minutes. The plague's second perk is Infectious Fright. Hearing the cries of the unfaithful gives the plague the power to see how to put them on the path of righteousness. Any survivors that are within the plague's terror radius whenever a survivor is knocked into the dying status will let out a yell and reveal their location for a short duration. The plague's final perk is Dark Devotion. The display of the plague's power creates a whirlwind of panic that spreads throughout the land. With Dark Devotion, the plague becomes obsessed with one survivor. Hitting the obsession will cause the plague's terror radius to be transferred to the obsession for a short duration. So far, the plague is the only killer that we know that might have eventually escaped the entity's clutches. Though, if this is true or not, begs into question what she did to escape. And if she did it by working with the other killers, the other survivors, or simply by stepping over anyone who got in her way. And that's it for our final Dead by Daylight lore dive for the time being, though of course we have another chapter coming out right around the corner, so it won't be that long. I have to admit that the Plague is one of my favorite killers, and I was excited to be finally getting to her. Special thanks to Jon Rob for allowing me to use his music for both the Plague and the Spirit. They were both really fantastic, and if you haven't heard them all the way through, I suggest taking a look at them by following the links down below. Next up, we've got the Resident Evil lore dive coming up, as well as the winner of the lore dive poll, which you guys wanted it, so it's Friday the 13th. Like always, let me know if there are any episodes of Loredive that you would like to see, as I definitely want to keep this series going. I'm also going to be setting up a Patreon page for anyone who would like to donate. If I eventually make enough, I would of course love to be able to do this full time. I'm not going to be putting it up immediately since I haven't fully decided what the different tiers are going to be, but I'll definitely announce it before I do. And with that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.